Assalamu alaikum everyone.
Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome back to another episode of Dear Lifesaver by Islamic Relief UK.
Here we're tackling some big questions we have about aid in the 21st century, finding out what it takes to save a life and exploring how faith factors into all of this. I'm Sara.
And I'm Nabilah, and today we're speaking with climate campaigner Suleiman, who currently works for C40, the city's climate leadership group, which comprises of 97 cities pushing for a more sustainable future for our world.
Assalamu alaikum, Mana. How are you doing?
Salam, how are you?
Good, it's lovely to see you
It's
again.
so good to be here. It's like a reunion.
It is. So I met Mana doing a podcast interview at Marliaf, and it was for the same subject. It was for the climate crisis. It was an episode called What's Race Got to Do with the Climate Crisis? And Nabilah...
And I met Minna, how many years ago now? 2015, I think it was.
Yeah, I think I
That's
just
like 6 years
graduated
ago.
from uni, so 2014-15.
Yeah,
fresh
Made,
out.
So the original Muslim climate
I
organisation.
know, we can
go
say
into
that. Yeah, it was the OG for sure.
Yeah.
I used to hear about Made through the grapevine. It was just like this cute little environmental
Family.
green space
Yeah.
in East London Mosque, and I wanted in.
Honestly, they inspired me so much.
Yeah, they did some fantastic work, and it's a real shame that they're no longer in action. But it's good to know that they had, you know, you've got like a Made veteran who came through right at the beginning, and then when I interviewed you last, you were at Friends of the Earth.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself, what you're currently doing, and then we'll jump straight into our subject for today.
Yeah, amazing. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Mona Suleiman, and I'm a climate campaigner. I've been campaigning on climate for a few years now. Sara said, I was at Friends of the Earth, and that's for a long time there, working on climate and air pollution. And now I'm at C40 Cities, where I'm working on kind of a global Green New Deal program, so working to support specific cities who want to deliver inclusive climate action.
Wow.
So it's I've only been there for a few months, but it's really fantastic. And I think working with mega cities generally, we're able to show what cities can and have delivered, and then hopefully use that to push national and international governments to do their bit too.
Oh my God, that's so exciting.
Yeah.
I am really interested in the city aspect of it as well, because I think one question that's always on my mind is how big metropolises like London can suddenly reinvent the wheel here and tackle the climate crisis. So would you be able to tell our listeners right off the bat, in a nutshell, what the climate crisis is?
Yeah, of course. So the climate crisis, you might have also heard climate breakdown or climate emergency, really is about kind of human use of oil, gas, coal. And essentially when we burn these fossil fuels, they release a gas called CO2, carbon dioxide, and that traps kind of the sun rays and essentially warms up the planet. Without making this like a Key Stage 2 science lesson. But as the planet warms, there's obviously massively devastating consequences of it. And we are seeing the consequences. So we're talking about extreme weather, floods, droughts, famine. And if without kind of drastic action from governments, that will only continue. In a nutshell, it's a crisis that will affect every part of our lives if we don't take action.
We were talking yesterday about how I feel like this generation has grown up learning about the climate crisis through David Attenborough and like his documentaries. Every single one of his documentaries has just gotten like progressively worse. And the most recent one was pretty much like we're at a point of no return. So if there was like one element or something you could highlight particularly about the climate crisis, especially with your wealth of experience and knowledge as well, what would that be?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Firstly, yes, on David Attenborough, I feel like when he did his Blue Oceans one, there was... I feel like just the surge in like concern around plastic was massive. I mean, there's loads to highlight around the climate crisis, but maybe one that's particular to like the Islamic Relief audience really is that we may think of extreme weather when it comes to the climate crisis, but the climate crisis as a whole kind of exacerbates existing inequalities that we have. So if we're concerned about famine, if we're concerned about war, or, I think the Muslim community is really great on like supporting humanitarian crises, then we need to be concerned about the climate crisis. I think sometimes we can see it in this very, niche silo, or we can see a specific audience caring about it. We can see, middle class white people more likely to care about it. But actually, the climate crisis affects Muslim people, affects Black and brown people disproportionately, and we need to be on the front line working to call for action, because it's us, people like us, our families, quote unquote, back home, who are facing the brunt of it.
And it's such a it's such a significant part of our faith as well. Like without it, then, and how does that? Could you speak a little bit about that, like how faith kind of ties into your role?
Yes, for sure. So I mean, this kind of also links back to Maid a little bit. So I think my story with the climate crisis, so I went to a very liberal university. I went to SOAS University. Shout out if you know it.
If you know, you know.
If you know, you know. If you don't, get to know. And there was very clear eco warriors there, people who were concerned about the climate. But I just felt very alienated by how they approached me. It just wasn't my crowd. I didn't feel like I fitted in with how they presented how to get involved. So I actually was like, okay, that is an issue. Is it for me? Maybe not. And then I left university and really wanted to campaign and wanted to get experience. And then I saw Maid had role for Maid, who were an environmental Muslim organisation, and they had a role for a campaign intern. And I applied, and alhamdulillah, I got the role. And it was there that I really was able to unpack the role of faith in that, and the idea of being in Islam, being a steward of the earth, and treating everything and everyone with kindness. So even how we use resources, make sure we use it efficiently, so they're there for the next generation. And then I kind of also in my head was like, actually fulfilling my kind of duties for the environment was also fulfilling the duties for my religion. And the two are the same, and I don't think they're as connected. And even when the Prophet ﷺ talks about consumption, he talks about leaving your belly only feeding yourself a third. That idea now, we're kind of mass consumption, we're kind of doing everything to their max, really goes against the teachings of our religion. So I think it's fundamental, and I also do think it's a tool that we as Muslims who are in the climate space can use to inspire others.
I mean, that speaks a lot to the value of the work that we're currently doing at IR as well. But I want to kind of bring it right back to what that cycle is like, who's responsible for the climate crisis, how it's perpetuated, because I know that you also referred to who it disproportionately affects as well. So, I mean, from a macro lens, how does this thing get started and how is it sustained?
Yeah, good question. So one of the big polluters, simply put, is companies. So fossil fuel companies are responsible for around 70% of emissions. So it's 100 companies are responsible for 70% of emissions. So that's where it starts. The people who are seeking to produce and then burn and use fossil fuels and keep it sustained because it is their business model. Right. And then there would be, I guess, a next level up is really trying to tackle kind of the political space that may enable companies to do that, and in some ways, subsidize that. And the rationale has been, around economic stability and a need for it. And really our world as it is, which is why it's so important that we transition properly away from fossil fuels. It's kind of, we're dependent. We've been built in a way that's so interlocked with fossil fuel subsidies. So I would say those, I guess, are the bigger kind of culprits, if we're going to use that word. And then I would look to kind of richer nations as a whole. I think there's something around who consumes the most and who emits the most. So Oxfam research shows that the poorest 10% only, so the poorest 50%, only emit 10% of emissions, are responsible for 10% emissions. So I think there's a clear link there. And I think we need to make sure as we move away from this, we do it properly. We can no longer be relying on fossil fuels. We can't dig up anymore. We can't burn anymore because, the very state of the planet is at risk.
Yeah. And what would you say to people who write off any efforts to curb individual efforts to tackle the climate crisis? Things like, recycling isn't really that important. I'm going to get a car because it's not really going to make that much of a difference. There are already so many in the world. So, I mean, how would you kind of approach that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question because on an individual level, of course there are things that we can do and things that we should do. And I think it's an interesting question because let's be realistic, recycling isn't going to save the world, it isn't going to get out of this crisis. But I think what we can do on an individual level does in some way create a culture shift. I think it creates a difference in the society that we want to build. It sets an expectation for what we expect from decision makers, and it really shows where our values are at as a community. And I think there's something to be said about that. And I think we should see it in its context. I also disagree with people who are like individual action. So like, you know, why would a company like, you know, Shell, for instance, being like, hey guys, what can we do to solve the climate crisis? You know, recycle more. And it's like, maybe you should stop, you know, drilling for like fossil fuels. So I think that's kind of how I would see it as well. And I would also, with individual action, really tell people to just take it one step at a time. Right. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but like with the environment specifically, you kind of need to be an all-out 10 out of 10 performer, or you're almost like delegitimized and what you do. And I think that is a barrier for people who maybe want to take this small individual action, but just sometimes don't feel like worthy enough or feel like they have to do everything to qualify.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you guys experience that, but I think for me that is such a blocker for people wanting to just do more eco things in their own lives.
Of course.
Especially with like social media like at play as well, where you just see so much kind of online with people doing the most and shopping here and using like being completely waste free and those sort of things.
Yeah, I would say the same. There's also the barrier to entry, but there's quite a lot of stigma around environmental justice and campaigning, and also there's so many misconceptions about what the climate crisis is and how to, you know, actively tackle it. And it's one of the biggest reasons we're doing this episode as well, is because this knowledge is really accessible. So yeah, it's definitely something that I resonate with.
I think a lot of the consumption or learnings or education comes from Netflix or comes from like online media. And I wondered, like, how would you, like, for those that have kind of like lost hope, like how would you encourage them to like care? Like how would you encourage people to care?
Yeah, I think people can definitely feel overwhelmed with the climate crisis, and you can feel like, what can I do as one person?
You mentioned it. There was a very specific term I remember you used when I interviewed you last.
Eco-anxiety.
That's
maybe?
it. I think it was. I think it was something like that. And you said that it predominantly affected Generation Z, or like the youngest generation. And that there was this real phobia or paralysis almost when it came to the climate crisis.
Yeah,
that really stayed with me.
Yeah, eco-anxiety is really prevalent and rising, and definitely affects the younger generation who are looking at the state of affairs and are genuinely really concerned for their futures and then the futures of others to come. So it's definitely overwhelming. There's a fear of you're like you said, the paralysis, and this kind of idea of what can I do as like one person on the planet of billions. And I think for those people, what I would say is, and maybe this is a bit too techie to start off with, but a recent report from the IPCC, who are essentially global scientists who advise on climate. It was a stark report around the situation of the crisis, but what they did say was kind of every fraction of change that, or like emissions saved, matters and affects what we do. Yeah. So I would say to those people, we have so much still left to fight for, and so much that we're trying to save, and your voice matters in that. Action is only achieved from, you know, people, and when they lend their voices to it. And I think that's kind of what I would try to activate. Yes. And I would also say to people in those situations, you know, if you do care and want to make a change, but you're just feeling overwhelmed, you know, can you find like-minded people? You know, can you join a community group in your area, a space where you can really air out those anxieties, those feelings of sometimes feeling, you know, hopelessness, a space where you can then air it out and then work together collectively to transform your local area, transform your country, and then overly transform the world in some ways. Yeah. So I would absolutely say that I resonate with it, you know. And I guess my final piece of advice for people going through the motions would be to look how far we've come. I think now climate is on the agenda. It's on the agenda. You know, it's no longer a case of if it's gonna happen. It's when. And what we need now is to see the action being delivered at the scale we need it and at the level that we need it. So far we've come so far, and yes, there is a way to go, but try not to lose hope, because your voice matters, and we need you in that fight.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful piece of advice. And here in the West, where we can't see it as, it's not hitting us as hard as it is, you know, certain other communities around the world, and it's still holding that space for people to treat it like we would a physical ailment, or, you know, any day-to-day kind of struggle that we're all having, and so it should. I just wanted to also touch on very important movements like the Black Lives Matter movement. We're in Black History Month at the moment. We've also touched on this subject before in our previous interview about what race has to do with the climate crisis, and I was curious to know what social and systemic racism has to do with the climate crisis and who this disproportionately affects around the world.
Yeah, so the climate crisis is a social justice crisis. It can't be separated. And it's very clear that as part of that, you know, Black and brown and minority communities feel the sharpest effects of it. And that's within like Western countries, as well as when we look at the global scale as well. So within Western countries, for instance, so let's say that in the UK, you know, Black people are, you know, less likely to be able to access quality green spaces, you know, less likely to have, you know, maybe an outdoor space within their home, more likely to live in areas where there's higher air pollution. So there is a real clear link between race, and this is a similar story for, you know, countries around the world as well. And then we look at it on a global level. Countries in the global south have been dealing with and face, you know, extreme weather. So we're seeing the rise of sea levels. So that means, you know, flooding more likely, droughts more likely, and then the subsequent things that happen from them: famine, displacement, war, conflict, because resources become so scarce. And it even trickles over into, like, you know, gender violence as well. So it's a real kind of domino effect. And there's an absolutely thread within there of race, class that goes within there. And I think there's also something to say around, you know, because communities in the global south who may face the extreme weather aren't built up from an infrastructure point of view to be resilient to these crises, when it does happen, that it's almost more devastating, because it means it's kind of almost a total wipeout of communities, which is unacceptable and something that needs to be on the front line.
Absolutely. I think that's another question that I had here for you, was how it is affecting us here in the West.
I'll be honest, when it starts raining now, I do also just look at the flood drains. I'm like, are you working today?
I know, oh God, I remember, what was it? It was that station next to the Tower of London that got absolutely, I've never seen anything like it.
Stratford, wasn't it? I remember.
Yes.
Was it Stratford as well?
I heard like fully,
That was so awful.
Honestly, and then I think, so it's clear to see the effects that are reaching us, and they will get worse. We've, you know, just the past years have almost been like record-breaking heat.
Yes.
We've had heat waves. I do remember a few years ago that there was one summer where it was absolutely unbearable. So we are seeing the effects, and we're even seeing, you know, the prospects of, you know, UK towns being, you know, climate refugees.
Yeah.
So we're seeing coastal areas being eroded, as in the rise of sea levels. And which means that, you know, the communities there would have to then, would be displaced. So we're not immune, and I think it's important to remember that in the narrative as well. Of course, the scale tips, you know, towards poorer parts of the world, for sure. But if without action, we're only going to see the consequence of the climate crisis hit us more.
And Muna, as like individuals and as groups as well, how do you, like, what are the first steps we can take to kind of like tackle the climate change, or what small steps can we take in our lives and like with our friends, with family? What would you recommend?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. And I think also when you're trying to inspire others in your lives to take individual action. So there's lots that we can do in terms of in our own lives. So There's, you know, how do we travel? You know, are we able to, you know, walk, take public transport? You know, what do we eat? Are we able to, you know, reduce our meat consumption, our dairy consumption? You know, could you trial it? Like Ramadan is a great time to, you know, try like a meat-free, you know, iftar. And obviously we're outside of Ramadan now, but, you know, you could do a meat-free Monday, for instance. You know, think about, you know, smaller things like, you know, the plastic around you, you know, start like going to the shops. If I forget my canvas bag or my tote bag, I'm like, why did I forget it? Small things like that can be integrated into your lives. You know, your fashion, the garment industry is textile industry is a massive polluter, and actually shows the links between, you know, climate, human rights abuses and workers abuses really well, and how similarly how again that affects Black and brown communities predominantly. So I'd say think about those in terms of making changes in your lives, and then I would also think about your voice, right? Because where individual action has a role to play, but we need, you know, national governments to do their bit as well. So, you know, can you use your voice to really, you know, speak to your local decision maker, you know, rally others around you, as like I say, join a community group so you're, you know, you have power in numbers. I think there's, that's how I would see it, as a kind of duality of like things I'm trying to do in my life, but then also how am I using my voice to elevate for the bigger actions. And I would just say go easy on yourself. You know, when you're keen, you want to do everything really fast. You may feel guilty for not doing something. You know, for instance, if you need a car because you have a disability or you're unable to afford something else, go easy on yourself. And I think similarly, when we are calling for action from, you know, national governments, it's important that then we call for action that enables people to make those changes in their own lives, and enables that to happen quicker, because people can only do so much without the support.
Absolutely.
And I guess it's like doing the best you can with what you have as well.
Exactly.
I remember working with Human actually on the Every Garment Has a Name campaign so many years ago now, but I think that was like a year after like the Rana Plaza factory incident in Bangladesh. And I'm just thinking about how when we were working on that, there was so much research done about like Islam and garments, and I remember a hadith which was like, pay your worker before their sweat dries, something like that. And we just read these, like found out about these really like kind of profound teachings like of Islam that I had no idea about, that is just like completely relevant to that situation. And I was going to speak a little bit about like one of the things, like, so I'm originally from Bangladesh, and there's a massive crisis there of like flooding, like monsoon, like extreme weather conditions. And I remember having to sit down with like my parents, my grandparents, and explaining like this is because of like our actions really in the like global north, and a result of climate change. And even that's a conversation, like those kind of conversations are really tricky to have with, like, there's language barriers and kind of cultural barriers there, but how would you bring that conversation home, or like how would you kind of have that conversation with, like, how do you make that cultural shift essentially, especially in a home where maybe there's a kind of lack of education around the climate crisis, or maybe a lack of resources growing up, that sort of thing? Yeah,
that's a really good question. And like similarly, so I'm from Somalia, and we experience like droughts, extreme droughts, and the community, like, it's connected to the community, so we have, you know, fundraisers where we send money, like resources to support them, and I think that's a really good question, because, you know, I remember once when I bought oat milk home and my mum was like, you paid how much for that oat milk?
That's an ongoing conversation.
Honestly. And she genuinely is like, she was like, do we have milk? And I'm like, mine was in the fridge. She's like, no. So I think one of the things that we can do is exactly as you've done, Nabilah, is to sit down and talk about it. And so whenever we speak about the droughts, I will say to my mum, oh, it's because, you know, it's going to get worse because of climate crisis. And I think even sometimes having the language for it in our, you know, in Somali was like difficult to even convey, because like the complexities of it, I was personally struggling to show it. So I think that's one thing that I do, is like label it and really try and emphasize it. And then in terms of encouraging change in the house, I think one thing that I like try to do is almost is like change by example. So if it's like, oh, like I'm not gonna have meat, like can you not can you like leave that out for me today, or like I've got, like I said, like the milk, or I'm not gonna buy this, I've already got enough of them, or let's not have more plastic bags. I think that's like what I would try and do in the house. I think it's a harder conversation to have, I'll be honest with you, and I don't think there's a silver bullet answering it. I think for me, what I would do, like if I was talking to anybody, would be to think through, what do my parents care about? What are their motivations? They have real concern for, their family back home, and then try and talk about it in a language that they understand, and recognize sometimes these things can take time, and there might not be an instant shift in, their mentality, but through consistency and through your own actions, and obviously actually sadly through seeing these events get worse and worse, I do think we can bring our parents and the older generation on side as well.
It makes me think a little bit about so very recently I kind of publish like the content on the social media platforms for IR, and one of the videos that we kind of published recently was the droughts in Kenya, and I think there is that like a lack of education, and I guess I don't want to say resources because there's so much out there, but even like the Islamic relief supporters or audiences who might even be listening today, who have donated to campaigns like for like the famine campaigns, the drought campaigns, ultimately like it all does just link back to the climate crisis. And I think it's as much as like donating towards that, I think at the same time there needs to be an understanding of like, why am I donating? Like, did I have to donate in the first place? It's because of like ABC that this situation is taking place in the first place. So I think it's that kind of education and understanding, having some sort of, I don't know, like centralized hub or something where
it goes right back to what you were saying at the beginning. Because one of the first things that you said was that some of these humanitarian issues that we're working on, and there's such a big emphasis from the Muslim community especially on humanitarian crises, is started, perpetuated, sustained, worsened by the climate crisis.
Exactly. It's true, and it's also about like who are the best messengers to deliver that to our parents. Sometimes we are not the best messengers, and it's similarly like with other issues that the communities are facing, like vaccines and things like that. Try and think about who would be the best person to deliver it. So I think I would love to see more people from the community, older generation, speaking up, because I do think there's something about like a peer-to-peer conversation that can make a difference.
Even Friday, like Jummah, like
exactly
these conversations. I feel like they very often it's like you push for it, like when it's like time for like COP, or when there's like like Muslim Climate Action Week, it's like, oh, let's have a green like khutbah, but why isn't something like that more kind of frequent?
I agree exactly, and I think like there's an authority that comes from the Friday sermons that sometimes can override us, because like my mom just sees me as like, oh, you Western girl, like you don't know what I've
with
been
your
through.
oat milk.
Exactly, like I'm almost like I'm the hippie in the house, and I was like, what? So I think I definitely think that carries weight as well.
I just thought straight away of my niece and nephew, and just children in general, and how we would educate them around. So I remember at Maid we had posters up, like even in the bathrooms, where sometimes there'd be like school children going inside those, and it would be like don't waste water even if you're a running stream. And I think like bringing education in from a really young age and connecting it to faith is so important.
What would you be able to elaborate on a concept like conscious capitalism? Because obviously we're working within a society that thrives on consumption, here in the West specifically. Can people be more conscious with their capitalism? Can they be more conscious with their consumption? How does it impact the acceleration of the climate crisis? And does it have a bigger impact, our conscious consumption, than something like switching the tap off or recycling?
I mean, it's hard to say in terms of actions, in terms of comparing them like for like, but I would say that having a consciousness is kind of the first step to change. So for me personally, let's say with clothes, that kind of consciousness of knowing fast fashion and the consequences it has on the planet, on the people that make them, and how it fuels a cycle, it is something that like stops me. So I, you know, ask myself, do I really need this item? You know, is it a good quality item? How many times, like, you know, the longevity of the material, etc., etc. I do think for us, there's two things, right? And maybe it goes back to how I was speaking about earlier around trying to create this culture change. I think once there's a larger consciousness with consumers, I do think that then hopefully can lead to an element of behaviour change.
I was just going to say, how do you get people to care? Because I just think that there is such a sense of apathy when it comes to, you know, I mean, we can talk about conscious capitalism till the cows come home, and we can sit there and analyse, you know, the supply chain, and it really does affect us in that moment. And then we go outside and all is forgotten as soon as we see that perfect pair of boots. Is there something that, you know, has been proven to anchor you or anchor people that you know it on this journey? You know, people who are really willing but find that willingness fleeting.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it kind of reminds me of like the journeys that people take to become vegetarians, for instance, of like that there was like a light bulb moment that made them switch. And to be honest, from my personal experience, I don't think they may be light bulb moments, but often it's quite incremental in the changes that people will say. And I think firstly, when I think about like trying to get people to change, I think about the who. So, you know, what actually is a motivating factor for them? You know, like, is it from an economic angle? Can you say actually if you invest in one good quality pair of an outfit, that will last you much longer than buying 10 things that will actually wear and tear and cause subsequent damage? Then it's, I guess, an element of trying to promote the environmental effects, the damages, the human rights angles from it. There's also something actually, if we're taking it away from the individual, but actually trying to get companies to act as well. Because I think individual voice matters, consumer voices matter, but actually also simultaneously, you know, NGOs, groups, community groups, individuals need to get companies to make sure what they're doing is in accordance with, you know, like it's transparent, you know, doesn't degrade the environment, and obviously it doesn't abuse the rights of workers. So I think there's a parallel there. I think it's one of those things, similarly to when we were talking about how to get our parents on side, that there is like no silver bullet, but I do think the more we talk about it, the more we show those images, the more likely we are to see people changing. And I do think people are much more aware than they were previously. I do think that people care. It's just tapping into that and leveraging that. And I think in these spaces of like hopelessness, and especially when we're talking about companies, I think we need to be quite aware of greenwashing as well, because I think we've now moved into a space where everyone's kind of aware of the environment, like more or less in the sense of like environment is an issue. But companies, you know, might position what they do as actually being quite ethical when it's not. And I think there's something around myth busting that for people, so they're able to then make informed choices for themselves.
I've seen that a lot on especially small businesses that have, you know, they use terms like eco-friendly or what have you, and you look at their supply chain and it will only, you know, be in reference to one specific aspect of it, and it's actually quite deceptive. And I do think that there is definitely an accountability for anybody that is contributing products, waste, consumption, anything to the world, as well as on the part of the consumer, because obviously that's the first place we look is the consumer, when really it's really a top-down issue as well. Like you said, there are some big companies at play. You also mentioned NGOs there. It's one of the questions we had down actually to ask you is what are the role of NGOs in the climate crisis and the humanitarian effects of those, or the humanitarian crises as a consequence?
Yeah, so I'd say the roles of NGOs can be varied depending on their own specialism and the model and how they work. So in terms of my own experience, you know, as a campaigner, that really is to create, you know, the political and public space and appetite for change. So it's like you say, trying to get people on side. It's trying to then leverage that onto the decision makers that have power. And you know, in my current role now, it's working alongside, you know, ambitious cities to deliver that, you know, work with them. And then there are, NGOs who might do like programs. So I think Islamic Relief is much more along those lines. So, working directly with affected communities on the ground, supporting them, you fundraise, for food or homes, or you support a well and, all of that jazz. I do think there are, some NGOs who have, much more kind of policy led, or can, advise really much more on the technical details. So I'd say they're really varied in how they work. And, the final one is probably some also very work well with communities as well on the ground. So I'd say they're all varied. I think they all probably unite around the same kind of progressive values and wanting to see action and wanting to see change. So I think they have a role, and I think to be honest, historically, I guess NGOs are trying to plug spaces where there is a need for change, but trying to create that kind of momentum, and plug the vacuum probably that exists.
Right.
I was going to ask just a little question about, I feel like there are a few terms that we've used so far that everyone might not be aware of. So I want to go back a little bit, but I think one of the words that you mentioned was greenwashing, and I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit on that.
Yes, official term. So
is it an official term?
Yeah, it is an official term,
okay.
but my recount of it might not be.
That's all right.
So greenwashing would be, positioning yourself as, or doing an act that's very climate friendly, but in fact it isn't. It also similarly could be trying to attach yourself to things that are related to the climate crisis as a way to cover your own actions or polluting actions. It's really kind of a disingenuous act to basically cover what you're doing, or to almost use the climate as a way to propel your business or issues in a disingenuous way. And I think it's something that we need to be much more aware of, especially as issues around the climate progress.
Yeah.
And another term as well. So you described the term a climate campaigner. What does a climate campaigner do? How do you become a climate campaigner? And how do you avoid greenwashing?
That's it. When you were like, what is a climate campaigner? I feel like that's my mum when she's like, what do you actually do? Your parents don't really know what you do. So a climate campaigner works on a climate, but works to advocate for kind of climate issues and the delivery of climate solutions in line with, the scale of the crisis. So for me specifically, in my role, that means working with community groups in the past. It means, working around public pressure, public events. You might see, things through petitions, online actions. It could be real life events when we used to have them a lot. So it's all really varied. It could be working to support lobbying MPs. So it's kind of essentially really building the public and political capacity to have the solutions that we need. In a nutshell.
It's like an awareness machine.
Awareness, and also, exactly, in combination with supporting communities on the ground as well, potentially. For some people the community element might not be there.
Yes.
I think the model in different, let's say, organisations might differ. And how can you be a campaigner? It's really interesting. I think I never, when I left university, sought out to be a campaigner, in terms of having that as my day job. I do think it's an industry or like a job that is actually quite harder to get than it should be. So my route was to have, internship with MAID, and then I actually had another internship, and then I got a campaigns assistant role. So that would be the usual trajectory. But I definitely would recommend people who want to do campaigning on a day-to-day job to just start doing it in their personal lives.
Right.
Anyway, and I do think good campaigners usually have that. They have, they're fired up by the issues. That usually is what they work on a day-to-day, and that is something they would do in their personal time. And it allows you to gain experiences, meet new people who could support you, and kickstart that journey there, and just genuinely perseverance. And I think that's advice for wider roles and not just campaigning per se.
And what kind of challenges do you experience in your role?
Yeah, that's a good question. In my campaigning career, I think it kind of echoes to what we've been speaking about now. Probably the biggest challenge that I face with and try to grapple with is getting more diverse people to be in the mix. And I think whilst we have moved in that direction, I do think that's something that we're still grappling with. I remember doing an interview once, and the interviewer asked me and was like, but the climate crisis isn't popping off in my group chat. And I was like, oh, that's a really interesting way to look at how like well an issue resonates and whether people talk about it. And I do think it has started popping off my group chat, thankfully. But it's, you know, extreme weather moments, you know, especially around the flooding that we had like a month or so ago. But I think that's probably a challenge that we grapple with, and trying to make, you know, the climate issues resonate with people who on a day-to-day basis, you know, might be concerned about bills, you know, they might be worried about feeding their family, you know, jobs. And I do think actually there's a big opportunity there with climate. I think especially as we build back from, you know, coronavirus, there is a big opportunity to connect that climate issues can also really help create a better society for everybody. You know, it can help clean up our air. We can actually build, you know, homes that are fit for purpose, that are safe and comfortable, that could, you know, lower bills for families. It can create more jobs, sustainable jobs for people. And I think, to be honest, you know, actually speaking back to the questions that we were speaking about earlier, we need to connect the dots for climate, and it's not just this isolated, you know, deliver on climate and all it works is just for emissions, but actually we can transform the lives that we lead and the lives of our families and the future generations if we act on climate properly. Sometimes also I think there's such a rep when it comes to climate about being preachy, and I think, you know, everyone just feels like, I remember when I first got my first climate job, someone was like, oh no, you're going to be like on your more higher ground now, you're going to be preachy. And I was like, babes, I'm not. But I think there's something to be said around like the perception of that. And I think sometimes, like, if you're with your friends and family, like, read a room, you know, like, if you're like, if your messages aren't landing or they're just getting irritating, maybe that's counterproductive to what you need to do. And it could just be, like you said, Nabilah, like, through watching you, that might be the best example. You might not even need to say anything potentially. But I mean, I think conversations are obviously good, but I think there's something around just knowing how you're doing things, because I think the how can also be quite alienating. And we've seen that with, you know, a few, you know, environmental, you know, protests that have happened that can be quite alienating to specific community, like Black and brown communities. So I think the how is as important to like what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
And I feel like even like I'm just going back to social media again, because that's one place where I see it so like all the time, like on my explore page, where it's like this person's living in this particular way, and it just feels like it's so hard to reach. Like, what can I do to get there? Like, it just, I'm not there yet, and I feel like I'm destroying the planet through my actions. But it's like, where do you begin? And I think you have to remember, like, the little things that we're doing. It's something not to, I don't know if celebrate is the right word, but try, like, doing your best and kind of like being content with that, and like being like the consciousness part is massive. And like, as long as you're conscious and like taking those steps to ultimately, you know,
exactly,
like with the intentions.
And social media, like what you see on there is it's like with everything, isn't it? It's always this like hyper focus on like 2% of someone's life, so that what they're doing in their lives, who knows what they're doing for 98% of it. So it's like, don't compare or use social media as a way to like let you or put yourself down in any way, because I think it's such a microcosm, and I think with the climate issue, like you say, you either feel like you're terrible or you're doing great, but actually just keep persevering, just keep trying to do your best, and I think that is good enough. And that is what I think through those small actions you can also then activate. You can I think you can activate more actions for yourself, but also you can then use your voice to call on, you know, like national decision makers. You've
called it you referred to it as a journey quite a few times in this conversation, and I think that's a really you know, beautiful and accurate way of describing it. Ultimately, we don't know what our day-to-day actions are going to have in, you know, the long term. I mean, we only ever really have today, and we kind of have to just, you know, take that step-by-step action as you've said and described. I did want to ask one question, and I don't want to leave it on this, so hopefully we'll be able to pick it back up again.
Is it going to go down?
It's going to go down. I do think it's important to ask this question, because I think it's going to be the one on everyone's lips, which is, are we too far gone in the climate crisis that we're in at the moment? All the stuff that we're talking about now, is it even going to be relevant to us in 5-10 years? I feel like all I hear in this conversation sometimes is like the end of the world is coming, especially in the Muslim community. Like, it's end times, these are signs of the times. And, you know, there will come a point where, you know, the climate crisis won't discriminate any longer. It will be every single person, you know, and that is, I mean, it just says so much about, you know, where we're at as a global community at the moment, that we're even letting it happen to, you know, a disproportionate amount of people, certain communities around the world. So, yeah, I hate to be this guy. Unfortunately, I do fall into kind of this category of getting quite hopeless. So a lot of this is quite a good conversation for me. I'm like a prime example, guinea pig of somebody who really gets paralysed by these conversations. Are we too far gone, Rana?
That is a deep question. I can feel as you speak the emotion from it. So I would say we still have so much left to fight for and achieve. And as I was referencing the report earlier, everything that we do to like save on emissions can have a positive impact for the world that we live in. And I would say there's what we're fighting for now. The climate crisis is overwhelming. It can be really easy to succumb to the doom and gloom. And I don't want to belittle that. And I want to acknowledge it. That's a real thing, because we are in a crisis. We're seeing extreme weather. We've experienced it now in London and in the UK and in the global north. So that is a fact. But I want to twist it and turn it to hope. I think there is so much that can be done and we should do to ensure things don't get worse and ensure we're preserving the planet that we have and the lives and the livelihoods that we have. And I think, you know, the science shows that if we act now, we can work to bring down global temperatures. So what I would say is turn that kind of like doom and gloom into like positive action if that's possible and if that's available to you. So that would be call on your decision makers who have the power to act and bring about the change that we need, because I think that is where the change lies. And we're going into COP26 in November, where global leaders around the world will meet and pledge their emissions and what they will cut by 2030. And I think that is a critical milestone. Yeah. And I think so much has changed and shifted. Public opinion has really increased, really grown, has come on side. I think we can talk about the climate crisis in a way that resonates. And I do think, so what I'm trying to say is your feelings matter. It's understandable as to why you feel like that. But I do think with the power of people, the younger generation, Greta Thunberg and how she's inspired the school strikers, and the millions of people that care, we can work to push those in charge to turn things around. And I think we need to hold on to that, because if we don't hold on to that, then it's game over, right? Because I think holding on to that will keep us going. And I think to quote Michaela Loach, who is a climate activist, really great on social media, and I think she says that, I don't know if it was her own words, but when we're campaigning or when we're outraged about an issue, we need to keep the anger, but we also need to keep the joy. And I think the two things have to be in parallel, because if you have just the anger, then you can be like succumbed. And I think the joy helps to counteract that, because I think the joy is about what you're fighting for and not what you're fighting against. And I think what you're fighting for needs to be on the front mind as well to inspire. So you're fighting for the healthy planet, you're fighting for nature, the animals, you're fighting for me, livelihoods of my family in Somalia. I think keeping the joy as well as the anger is the kind of the winning combination. And also rest. Sometimes it's important, if it's too much to look on the news, turn the news off. If you feel like you need a break from activism, and if you need a break from it, that is your right. Rest is important because it's how you sustain yourself, it's how you sustain your voice.
It's so beautiful.
Many, you're my face of optimism for this conversation.
You can do it. I don't you have my number, so you can just text me.
No, it actually really helps. I think that speaks to the value of everything that you've just talked about, that you've just mentioned that and offered that, because we do need these spaces. I need these spaces to ask questions and talk about it and make this conversation accessible. You do, Nabilah. Anyone listening does. And thank you for just bringing this whole conversation back up to a level of, hope and faith that is instilled in us in our deen as well. So much of what you said really goes right back to what you were talking about in the beginning with regards to how faith comes into the work that you do, and just seeing yourself as a steward and looking at our deen and how holistic the approach that you've described is, and how that's in our faith as well.
I was so kind of afraid of this, I think I'm like you, Sara, just very overwhelmed by all of the information that's out there and all of it's just overconsumption of the same. And it like you said, Mona, it's turn it off when you need to turn it off. But I think that how you framed and spoken about everything, it makes it easy to reapproach. And it's very, mashallah, inspiring and eloquent and really beautifully put. And I'm really excited for people to listen to this, because I think a lot of the time, even how you explained the term climate crisis at the beginning, you did it so
nutshell,
concise, and it was so easy to understand.
I'm not a scientist, and even when I'm at work, and I'm like, okay, break this down for me. I think I'm just me, and I think you're right. Sometimes there's a technical barrier to people understanding things. There is. And I think the climate crisis isn't as ambiguous as it used to be. Yeah. But I do think there's you hear emissions, ozone, you hear different things, and you're I need a dictionary to really unpack this. And I do think actually that's something that we as a movement can do, making climate more accessible, lowering the bar, and that you as you are now have a role in this movement, and whatever your skill is. And I think when we think of campaigning, we might think of it in a specific way, but if you're an artist, can you draw your vision? Can you use that to promote the climate crisis? If you sing, can you do that? If you're in the mosque, can you promote it in the mosque? Whatever you do with your own skills is valuable to making sure we bring about the world we want to see. You don't have to convert or be this machine or copycat of what an activist should be. You and the skills you have are valid, and what we need, we just need more people on site.
You're a critical voice for that, and I'm so glad that our listeners will get the opportunity to listen to someone like you, and know where their donations are going, and kind of understanding the holistic nature of the humanitarian crises that Islamic Relief UK and Islamic Relief is dealing with, and other NGOs all over the world. So thank you. It's been a real pleasure talking to you again.
Thank you so much.
Really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam, everyone.